Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme today, we'll be discussing Israel's biggest military operation in Judea and Samaria for almost 2 decades, as Israel sent in 2,000 IDF soldiers into the Palestinian city known as Jenin that has become a terrorist stronghold in order to dismantle Palestinian terrorist infrastructure responsible for the murder of 24 Israelis this year and over 50 Israelis last year, and it's become the epicentre of terrorism against Israel. We also saw that terrorists in Jenin tried to fire rockets into Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria that marked a game changer in the region, in fear that we could see that Judea and Samaria or the Palestinian Authority could turn into another Gaza, which meant that the IDF had no other option but to go in against the terrorists in Jenin. And yet, was any of this reported by our mainstream media? And that's what we'll be discussing in tonight's programme. Regan, it's good to see you on the programme, particularly as we discuss the truth of Israel's operation in Jenin, which was widely reported last week. Of course, Israel then became the centre of the kind of media story regarding this. And we've seen some horrific reporting regarding Israel's military operation against this Palestinian terrorist stronghold in the city of Jenin.
What strikes me, Simon, when it comes to any reporting on what's going on in Israel is that there's so often lack of ability to disassociate events from that are unrelated to other events in the country. So there's been a lot of furor. We've talked about it over some of the new government and its actions and whatnot that people don't like. Okay, across the board, people in Israel and outside don't like where some of that's going, but it has absolutely nothing to do with this very well planned counter-terror action in Jenin. And what we need to do is learn to disassociate our likes and our dislikes from facts. And the fact is that Jenin has been historically a hotbed for terror organizations. The PA has next to no authority over and in Jenin. It's dominated by various terror cells that are very predominant in the West Bank, and of course also we can think of Gaza as well. But their action of sending 2,000 troops in to root out these terror cells was necessary for the stability not just of that region. Jenin is not stable, it's not a stable place, but for the stability of Judea and Samaria. And I was very happy. You know, there's been mixed signals at times that have come from this current president in the United States, but I was very thankful that there was just a brief, short statement from the U.S. saying that it continued to support Israel's right to defend itself against terrorism, because it acknowledged that there's certifiably evidence, basically, that terror cells are active, promoting themselves, these trends, even on TikTok, that are promoting acts of aggression against.
And I think the US administration did that primarily because behind the scenes, the Palestinian Authority will actually be very happy with this military operation. They won't be able to say it publicly. And even those terrorists that have been killed, thankfully 12 terrorists killed in this 48-hour military operation, no civilian casualties whatsoever, which is an incredible miracle. And they are then calling the PA traitors. This is Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, also this new Palestinian terrorist organization made up of very young teenagers known as the Young Lions. And they have actually effectively said that they been traitors to the Palestinian cause. And this is probably why the US administration are having no heavy condemnation of Israel, because, as you said earlier, that the Palestinian Authority has no jurisdiction in Jenin. Palestinian security operatives are not able to enter Jenin, so it's completely, they have no control. And it's just become an Iranian-sponsored terrorist stronghold that needed destroying by the IDF. So what we saw last week on Monday, the 3rd of July in the evening, that Israel launched 10 military drones and carried out strikes, deployed 2,000 IDF soldiers against the terrorists in the city, and that's within the Palestinian Authority. The city of Jenin itself has been used as an operational base for Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's been the epi-centre of Palestinian terrorism against Israel for the past year, and even security officials belonging to the Palestinian Authority are not allowed entry into this city. We see that the BBC misreported the two-day military offensive in Jenin, firstly as a massacre, with absolutely no facts or evidence to support their argument. They then showed live coverage of the funerals of the 12 Palestinians killed in the operation, but only referred to them as Palestinians, not terrorists. And then we see that the BBC's own anchor woman, Gadgil, in her interview with the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, said that Israeli forces are happy to kill children in a targeted attack. This shocking false narrative of international news coverage in the mainstream media needs to be exposed, and this is why we're telling the truth of Israel's military operation known as Beit Vegan, which translates in Hebrew, home and garden operation.
Yeah, Simon, it was absolutely abhorrent reporting. I remember when I first saw the headline, how it was being portrayed and presented. If you don't understand where Jenin is, what Jenin is, and the history behind it, you're just going to lap it up and think, oh, this is what's going on here, this is dreadful, and you're almost certainly going to link it to whatever issues have been flagged in regard to the current administration in Israel, and you're going to think, okay, yeah, this is evidence of, and that's how BBC was spinning it. They were spinning it as this just shows radicalization of normal Israeli politics, and this is it was presented as an act of escalation and aggression, completely ignoring the rocket attacks that have been going on, completely ignoring the fact that they were destroying underground bunkers, which were essentially illegal arsenals housing weapons and devices used for terror attacks on Israeli civilians. Next to nothing is presented about the daily attacks that various individuals across Israel will face, the daily threat of rocket fire in some areas. And so for the BBC to present their reporting in this particular way, and especially the abhorrent statement by Anjana Gadgil that Israeli forces are happy to kill children. It's shocking irresponsibility that takes the BBC's general irresponsibility in reporting on this to a completely different level.
No, of course, and of course that then also brings into question their trustworthiness, their honesty in kind of reporting and going on the emotional rather than actually basing on facts, which is a problem. Now, also, just to let you know a bit of context behind Israel's military operation known as House and Garden, that we mentioned earlier that 24 Israelis have been murdered from terrorists based in Jenin in 2023. Around 50 were murdered in 2022. And according to the IDF, residents of Jenin carried out some 50 shooting attacks, and 19 wanted Palestinians have tried to evade Israeli forces, have been hiding in Jenin. And according to JNS, there's been an escalation in shootings and bombings in the sector. And of course, the recent failed launching of rockets at the Jewish communities in the nearby Gilboa mountain range meant that the IDF had no other choice but to send in special forces in order to rid Jenin of its terrorist entity. Also see the Israeli operation involved roughly 2,000 IDF soldiers, 10 military drones, bulldozers and aircraft. And we have this excellent IDF video to explain Israel's military operation in Jenin last week.
Jenin is a Palestinian city located in northern Samaria. In 1993, when Israel and the Palestinian Authority signed the Oslo Peace Accords, Jenin came under the full control of the Palestinian Authority. This means they have full control over the administration, economy, and internal security in what is known as Area A. In the years following, Jenin's economy developed, opportunities opened up. Unfortunately, in recent times this has changed. They have since lost control. Criminal gangs and terrorist cells have taken over, using the city to store stolen and smuggled weapons and ammunition, leaving the area's inhabitants to fend for themselves. Simply put, terrorism runs loose in Jenin camp. In the last year alone, a total of 25 Israeli civilians were murdered in multiple terrorist attacks. 16 of the 25 victims were murdered by terrorists from the Jenin camp. As the Israel Defense Forces, it is our duty to protect Israeli civilians from terrorist threats. This is why, since 2022, Israeli security forces have been conducting counter-terrorism activities in Jenin, better known as Operation Break the Way. While the threat has weakened, the IDF intends to remove the terrorism embedded in the Jenin camp.
Well, what the IDF knew was present and what they discovered in Jenin were multiple manufacturing facilities, underground tunnel networks, weapons storage sites, IEDs, which are improvised explosive devices intended to be used against Israeli forces, Iranian supplied as well. They found Palestinian terrorists were storing weapons and explosives in a mosque. They carried out this operation against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Young Lions, as you mentioned, this emerging group supported by the Iranian regime, in which the Palestinian Authority has lost total control. PA security personnel have not even been permitted into Jenin. It's being presented as a refugee camp, and the BBC was, and the other papers as well, a lot of the papers were characterizing it as Israel invades refugee camp. And we have this picture so often of tents and, people in squalor. That's not what a refugee camp is in this context. It's normal housing. It's also, Jenin refugee camp is a small walled area within, we have to remember, it's a Palestinian city. Jenin is under those auspices, even if the PA doesn't have meaningful authority there. So it's a place that's been inhabited for decades by 6-7 generations of Palestinians. The IDF Operation Home and Garden was called out in Jenin refugee camp in a densely populated area of the Palestinian city of Jenin, located in the north of Judea and Samaria and within the Palestinian Authority. 12 Palestinian terrorists were killed in the operation. Only one elite soldier from the IDF Special Forces, of course, a very sad, tragic loss for his family.
So let's have a look at what the major operational objectives was from Beit Vegan, again in Hebrew from house and garden, was this one: to strike a blow at the underlying terrorist networks there, arrest or kill the terrorists and their supporters and capture of weapons, expose and destroy the workshops used to manufacture arms, reverse or curb the process of terrorist organizations taking root there, and bolstering their military capabilities, preventing Judea and Samaria becoming like a Gaza. Now, one thing I think is very significant that I don't think I've really seen much media coverage on, and that is the use of IEDs. And the use of IEDs, we know that Hezbollah used them against Israeli forces in southern Lebanon back in the late 90s, and that was responsible for killing a number of Israeli soldiers based in the southern security zone until Israel pulled out in 2000. They've also been used in Iraq against British troops and also in Afghanistan. So we know that this is a kind of Iranian operational tactics to kill as number of Israeli soldiers as possible, but this would obviously result in probably settlers driving back to the homes, into their homes, and being blown up by these IEDs. So that was imperative, but also the fact that they were starting to develop rockets and fire rockets at Jewish communities as well. That was the biggest game changer that the IDF and the Israeli government couldn't tolerate. The fact that the Palestinian Authority could be turned into another Gaza, whereby Israeli airport like Ben Gurion would come under the attack of these rockets and missiles, Jewish settlements, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem was just completely unacceptable for the Israelis, and this is why they had to act.
It's good to look at the history of Jenin and to recognize the ongoing relevance of that historical context. In the 1930s, of course, steering the British mandate, when the British police forces killed Is ad-Din al-Qassam near the village of Yabd in this sector, al-Qassam's name subsequently became a source of inspiration and a symbol of resistance for Hamas terrorist cells. During the Second Intifada, that's early 2000s, this area came to be renowned as a stronghold of Palestinian resistance. Fierce battle in the Jenin refugee camp is considered to be one of the most painful incidents of Operation Defensive Shield, during which the IDF forces incurred heavy losses. Just like today, then, too strong cooperation among the various groups in the refugee camp was a salient point, together with the use of improvised explosive devices and booby traps, the cynical exploitation of the local population of civilians and facilities playing a role as well. The ethos of resistance associated with Jenin soon became a symbol of the terrorist organizations, providing inspiration for Palestinian terrorists from Gaza and the Palestinian Authority. Operation Defensive Shield, which functioned between 29th of March through the 10th of May 2022.
2002.
2002, not 2022. According to Tel University, Defensive Shield was launched in April 2002 following an upsurge in Palestinian violence. The task of the Israeli Defense Forces in the densely populated Jenin refugee camp was to destroy the operational infrastructure of the militant organizations. With fierce fighting, casualties were high and reliable information on what was going on was scarce. The intense confrontation in a closed military zone created fertile ground for rumors and distorted reports. During Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, as the IDF was sent into Jenin to destroy Palestinian terrorist infrastructure, the Western media outlets reported the false Palestinian claims of a massacre by Israeli forces and that 1,000 civilians had been killed and were buried in mass graves. Now, eventually, the Western media did report the truth that 50 Palestinian terrorists had been killed, but this battle also cost the lives of 23 Israeli soldiers. We're 21 years after Defensive Shield, and this area has once again been established as a stronghold of terrorism in Samaria and a focal point for exporting terror across Judea and Samaria and into the heart of Israel. That, Simon, is why this operation was essential.
Absolutely. So thanks to our friends at CBN for these two reports on Israel's operation known as Home and Garden that occurred last week to destroy the terrorist infrastructure in Jenin. We have some good, factual and reliable reporting from CBN on Israel's military operation.
The operation included ground troops, more than a dozen airstrikes and special forces. One senior Israeli official said the goal of the extensive operation is to end Jenin's role as a sanctuary city for terror. One target was the command center operated by the Jenin Brigade, a group affiliated with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The IDF said it was a location for weapons and explosives and the hub for coordination and communication among the terrorists. In the past year, dozens of Israelis have been killed or injured by attacks from groups operating out of Jenin. Israel's Foreign Minister Eli Cohen told reporters that many of these Palestinian terror groups are now proxies of Iran.
We are striking the terrorism hub with a great strength. I want to emphasize that we don't have a fight with the Palestinians. Actually, our fight is with the proxies of Iran in our region, which is mainly with the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, with both are a terrorist organization which financed by Iran.
At least 5 Palestinians have been killed in the operation, with more than 24 wounded, but those numbers are expected to climb. Cohen said the IDF is working to prevent any harm to the local population. The operation is part of a promise by Prime Minister Netanyahu to respond to recent terror attacks, including an incident where 4 Jewish men were murdered at a restaurant and gas station by the Sumerian community of Eli. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
We begin in the Middle East, where the Israeli Defense Forces have pulled out of the Palestinian city of Jenin after 2 days of an intense counterterrorism operation. The Israeli move came after more than 50 Israelis were killed or injured from terrorist operations out of Jenin in the past year. 1 Israeli soldier and 12 Palestinian militants were killed during the fighting. Chris Mitchell joins us now from Jerusalem to discuss the operation. So, Chris, exactly what did Israeli forces find and what did they accomplish?
Well, Ephraim, they found thousands of weapons, explosive devices, the IEDs, ammunition, guns, at least 6 explosive manufacturing facilities during this time. And they also uncovered underground shafts, one of them in a mosque where they found underground weapons depots. So a number of all kinds of weapons. They found a lot of money supplied by Iran. And one thing to understand about this operation, Ephraim, was that Iran is funding and supplying a lot of these ammunitions and weapons to many of these terror groups. So that has a great impact on what's happening here. And so because of all this, it looks like they have really dealt a severe blow to many of these terror groups that have been operating out of Jenin for many, many years now.
Now, Chris, there was another terror attack in Tel Aviv on Tuesday. What can you tell us about that? And is this a tactic now being used by Palestinians?
It is a tactic used by the Palestinians. It was a car ramming. A terrorist injured at least 7 people, 4 seriously, and after that he went on a stabbing rampage. One of the victims was a pregnant woman who lost her baby after the attack. He was shot and killed by a civilian who happened to be in the area. I was near a ramming about this a couple of months ago. It's very deadly, Ephraim, and it's very random. You don't know when it can happen. And in fact, here in Jerusalem, they actually have put up barriers around some bus stops when people are just waiting around for the bus. But still, it's very hard to do that all over, many of these places. And so it's a very, very deadly tactic used by the Palestinians. You don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know when it's going to happen. And so it's very, very difficult to come against that or defend against that. But it's just one of the things. And Hamas praised that attack, and he said that it was actually in response to the Jenin operation. But hopefully many of the people that were injured today will get better.
Do you foresee another military operation real quick?
Not right away, Ephraim. It looks like Jenin has really been set back as a terror base for many of these groups. So you don't see anything quite yet in the near future. But it's good to be watching about what's going to happen in Gaza. Hamas fired 5 rockets yesterday in retaliation to the Jenin operation. We'll see if that would explode on the southern border.
All right, we'll continue to watch. Thank you. Our CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reporting for us from Jerusalem.
And this week's special guest on Behind the Headlines is Igal Het, who's a Canadian-Israeli award-winning film producer. Igal, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Behind the Headlines today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
And we also appreciate the fact that it's early in the morning in Canada, so appreciate your time. What are your thoughts on what is only being described as Israel's biggest military operation in Jenin for over 2 decades, from someone who's very closely followed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with your remarkable and award-winning films?
Right. So I think that this operation was extremely necessary. Jenin has become a hotspot, a hotbed, a base for what's called the Generation Z TikTok terrorists, where you have this breed of people in their late teens, early 20s, who are basically willing to terrorize Israelis, whether it's in Judea and Samaria or whether it's within Israel, for the likes, for the status on the street. And so for months there was a lead up. This didn't just happen. It's really always funny to watch the international media, jump on and harp on Israel during an operation and completely ignoring the entire narrative, where for about 6 weeks there were constant terror attacks that killed and injured dozens of Israelis in Judea and Samaria. And the place that these terrorists came from was Jenin. The PA, the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, has lost complete and all control of Jenin. Jenin is basically being run by pockets of terrorists and small gangs that are running and terrorizing Palestinians living within Jenin as well. And so this operation was extremely necessary. It was necessary from a military front because they were making roadside IED bombs, the kinds that British forces faced in Afghanistan, the kind that American forces faced in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And they were making hundreds of them, putting them along the roads of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, and blowing cars up and wanting to blow cars up, military, carrying operations against the Israeli military. They were carrying shootouts, drive-by shootings constantly, kinds that weren't even reported. Because if somebody doesn't die, it's not reported. But there were dozens and dozens of drive-by shootings against innocent Israelis, against just civilians, not military. It's important to note, not military, but innocent civilians that were just driving to their homes or driving to do some shoppings and things along those lines. So this was escalating for weeks, and nothing was being done. The PA, again, has no control in Jenin, so the Israeli military had to go in. This sort of operation, just to understand that this didn't just happen, this sort of an operation takes weeks, if not months, to plan. You're talking about 1,000 soldiers, I think, taking part in it. So, and remarkably, and this is again another thing that's being glazed over, is the fact that only 12 Palestinians combatants, 12 Palestinian militants, 12 Palestinian terrorists, whatever you want to call them, were killed, right? And that's remarkable by any sort of way to measure things, where it was extremely strategic, and the goal was not to kill Palestinians in any shape or form, to neutralize the terrorists, whether capture them or kill them, not to kill innocent Palestinians, but the goal was to find thousands of weapons, nearly 5,000 guns within Jenin, the bomb-making factories, and the bombs that they were making. The cynical, these terrorists were basically had makeshift, bomb labs under mosques, under kindergartens, in people's homes, forcing people to undertake in this, innocent civilians to undertake in this. And all of this was sort of kind of glazed over by the media. Oh yeah, it made it seem as if Israel just decided one day, hey, you know what we want to do? Let's send 1,000 people, 1,000 soldiers into Jenin to just kill Palestinians for the fun, for sports. It's ridiculous. I mean, any person would just an inch of honesty and a brain would realize that. But unfortunately, following especially the BBC, making claims that cross any sort of journalistic line, that what is allowed for a journalist to actually say, making basically blood label claims that the Jews, the Israelis are going in there to kill children, which is completely untrue. Once again, everyone killed. All these 12 terrorists killed were in fact terrorists. They all held guns in their hand. They were all shooting at Israeli soldiers. And
thank you for that. You've alluded to this anti-Israel bias. I mean, BBC was absolutely shocking, saying that Israel wants to kill children. It was an immense and gross statement that was made.
And they even realized how far they went. Obviously, it was their reporter, specific reporter, who had her own agenda. And they realized how far they went because they issued a statement, I think, a few hours later, realizing after pressure how far they went and how wrong they were. But I mean, this is par for the course for the BBC.
But what's behind it? What do you think? Why is there this drive? I mean, another statement that was being made right and left, especially by the BBC, was like Jenin refugee camp. And the thing is, I find in the West, most people don't have a clue what a refugee camp actually looks like or is in this particular context? What's behind it all?
Your typical anti-bias towards Israel. It's look, the BBC and the Guardian, and one would argue. Let me preface that. One would argue that the BBC and the Guardian and other specific British publications, have an inherent complete bias towards Israel. It stems from a number of things. It stems from the makeup of the reporters that are there and their agenda. It stems from the fact that they want to push this narrative as if the Palestinians are these, poor people that haven't had their own autonomy since 1993, where over $40 billion have been spent. So to your question, why is there a refugee camp? That's a very good question. There's a refugee camp because they want to continue with this narrative that Palestinians are seventh generation refugees, the only group of people that can inherit their refugee status. So they want to continue with that narrative. One should ask exactly why is there a refugee camp inside an autonomy that has had sovereignty for over 30 years now, for nearly 30 years now, has built absolutely nothing, has received $40 billion from the international community, which is more than what it took to build, all of Europe after World War II, has received this massive amount of money and has done absolutely nothing to build an infrastructure for its own people. Why is that? Well, one could make the argument that it's so to keep the status quo going, so you can get your funding from UNRWA, so you can basically, you can be used by the Arab League and by progressive forces around the world to continue and push Israel and continue to push this narrative that Israel is not willing to commit to a two-state solution, that Israel doesn't want peace, and basically paint Israel as this evil force in the world that should cease to exist. This is where it's really all heading towards.
Igal, with a minute left of the program,
Sure.
Why do we see the international kind of media outlets such as the BBC, CNN, and others not actually put this actual reporting in context? The fact that rockets were fired from Jenin at Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, meaning that is a complete game changer as a kind of that the Judea and Samaria could become like Gaza, with terrorists using rockets to fire at Jewish communities, to fire at the Israeli airport. Why do we never hear any of this news? And why do we ever hear the fact that these terror organizations based in Jenin were responsible for 24 murder of Israeli citizens this year and over 50 last year, never put in context?
Because they don't really care about Israeli lives. Israelis dying is legitimate in their minds. Israelis suffering is legitimate in their mind. And that's just the sad fact that nobody wants to talk about. Beyond that, I think there's a narrative within progressive circles and within the media world that Israel is, I'll put it in simple terms, Israel is the bad guy. Israel is the bad guy no matter what happens. Nobody ever questions what is it that the Palestinian Authority stands for. Certainly not the liberation of Palestinian people. It's certainly not peace. It's certainly not rights for minorities or rights for women or rights for other groups. No one ever questions that, because the narrative that prevails within progressive circles is that Israel is illegitimate and a colonial force that was imposed on the people that live there, which is a complete and utter fabrication and nonsense. But that is the prevailing narrative within, progressive circles, and the media, being more progressive than it is conservative, has to toe that line, and that's what it does. And also, let's just be frank, the makeup and the agenda of journalists that are now basically in powers, are the producers, etc. No media outlets is not biased. When you see the makeup and the political ideology of the journalists, and it's very easy to tell, you just need to listen to them, you start to understand why it is that they skew the story and why they approach a story in such a subjective manner.
Igal, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your expertise as an award-winning filmmaker, and thank you for the role that you do in bringing clarity to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and by telling the truth. And we really appreciate your insights in the program today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. All right.
Thank you very much to Igal for those very helpful commentary words there on what's going on. Very incisive.
No, absolutely. So as being a film director and producer, he has a real insight into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and is able to give a kind of proper media perspective on Israel's military operation in Jenin. I think it's also important to realise that the Western media like to play this narrative that Israel is a so-called colonial state. It's a Western implant in the Middle East. It doesn't have any natural origins in that area. And therefore, because we are post-modernist, we are post-colonial, everything that happens in the region is Israel's fault, and therefore we'll cover Israel in that particular narrative of doing everything that our mainstream media can do in order to support the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian narrative. But they also fall into a kind of very dangerous media trap that's been set by the Palestinian Authority, set by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And that's how they use Western media outlets as a strategic weapon against Israel to influence public opinion. And public opinion influences government policy of a way of preventing Israel from carrying out future military operations like the one in Jenin last week. So I came across a very interesting paper yesterday. So according to the academic paper produced by Tel Aviv University, as the current violent conflict with the Palestinians persisted and intensified, it's become painfully clear that Israel was unable to portray its position effectively in the international media, this dating back to Israel's last military operation against Jenin, and that was in the year 2002. And so for whatever reason, messages coming from governments and military spokespeople were confused, briefing for the press were erratic, and the information given there was treated with suspicion. While the acts of violence perpetrated against Israel were reported, these were quickly overshadowed by extensive coverage of Israel's counter-responses. It says here that the Palestinians realised soon after the violence began in September 2000 that other than suicide bombing, the media was the most important strategic weapon they possessed. One of the early and central goals of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, as the Palestinians named this war, was to internationalise the conflict and conjure up the type of international support that would limit Israel's freedom to use fully its force at its disposal, responding military to Palestinian attacks.
Now, in order to do that, the effective use of media was critical, and as became evident from the very early stages of the war and was immortalized by the footage of 12-year-old Mohammed al-Dura shot to death in Gaza, the Palestinians proved their ability to use the media to their advantage. The Palestinian Authority carefully selected good spokespeople who delivered consistent, unified and articulate messages with credibility, often to reporters and anchors who were all too pleased to listen and were extremely mild in their questioning. Palestinian cameramen working as stringers for the world's major networks whose own crews Israel, with dubious logic, had decided to keep out of the war zone, were trained and intimidated by the PA to, quote, frame the shot, end quote, magnifying what could only be seen as Israeli brutality and Palestinian suffering. In the rare cases where the international press did not toe the line, the PA was not above issuing blatant threats or expelling news reporters. At no time during this war was the lack of media awareness more dramatic than the period of the IDF's incursion into the Jenin refugee camp during Operation Defensive Shield in April of 2002, following the Passover evening carnage at the Park Hotel in Netanya, which I believe you've stayed at.
No, I've actually visited the aftermath of that terrorist attack a couple of months later. Absolutely horrific. 2 massive craters on the floor. you look up at the ceiling and there's still pipes and wire just hanging down from the ceiling. And you can imagine the complete and utter devastation those two Hamas suicide bombers caused at the Park Hotel in Netanya, together with killing a Holocaust survivor that actually effectively launched Operation Defensive Shield in April 2002.
And what happened in Operation Defensive Shield in that aftermath of that terror attack caused many across the world, the way it was being presented, and including some in Israel as well, to believe that a massacre had taken place inside the camp in retaliation, that every house had been destroyed, that young men were being lined up and indiscriminately shot, and that Israeli troops, after losing 13 men in an ambush, went on a murderous rampage of revenge. This is how it was being presented from the Palestinian side. The networks reported hundreds killed, and NGO, Red Cross and European diplomatic eyewitnesses were given numerous minutes of airtime to report the stench of bodies, the rubble, and the piles of dead. When it was over, 56 Palestinians were killed in the Jenin refugee camp, most of them armed men. Of almost 2,000 homes in the camp, 130, a dozen of them bomb-making factories were destroyed. So a far cry from what was being reported. Throughout the conflict, as opposed to what was reported, Israel and PA officials in Jenin, and in some cases the Red Cross and UN officials as well, maintained constant contact. Throughout, together they worked out a system for allowing ambulances safe passage and facilitated the distribution of all humanitarian aid that arrived, such as blankets from the Israeli Arab community. Israel delivered 3 electric generators to the hospital to guarantee its continued functioning. None of this being reported at all. Neither was the decision by Israel's Minister of Defense to use infantry and not F-16s as the army had requested, despite the near certainty that this would lead to even more Israeli casualties, which indeed it did. The minister was aware of 11 what the probable collateral damage would be from an airstrike in terms of Palestinian civilian casualties, and hence his decision. By the time Israel finally opened the camp to reporters, the world believed that there had been a massacre in Jenin because of the haphazard and disorganized way in which Israel allowed the media to enter the camp. The Palestinians were the first to get to the microphones with stories of horror, all told against a backdrop of destroyed houses and rubble. In the Arab world, the Janine Massacre became entrenched in the Palestinian narrative, no matter what reports by the UN and others subsequently found. Also, no documentation was ever provided showing that the houses destroyed had either been bomb factories or were used by the terrorists to resist the IDF. So Israel's voice effectively was not heard.
And what was also very disturbing about the so-called Janine Massacre, which now proved to be an absolute lie. As I remember, it's on the front page of all the national newspapers here across the UK that Israel's committing a massacre. The whole media swung against Israel. I think George W. Bush was in power then, as US president, was under huge pressure to condemn Israel. So was Tony Blair as prime minister in this country. World public opinion turned against Israel. And if you can imagine it, taking yourself back to 20 years ago, or 21 years ago, Israel was under incredible fire. I mean, you literally had 2 or 3 suicide bombings going off a day. You'd have suicide bombings going off in shopping malls in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, buses blowing up, cafes being blown up, Israelis being shot. It was an absolutely horrific time. This is in the context of Yasser Arafat rejecting what is known as the Camp David peace accords for a Palestinian state, and then just literally lit the touch paper for what is known as the Second Intifada, a terror war against Israel using suicide bombers. I mean, it was just a horrific time in Israel. So Israel had no other choice but to dismantle the terrorist network that Yasser Arafat built ever since signing the Oslo Accords in 1993, and actually to do this. Now, we see that the same lies are being repeated again against Israel as they were 21 years ago in Jenin. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News item that is called Israel versus the Media.
During an interview with former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, a BBC anchor made the following statement.
Terrorists, but children. The Israeli forces are happy to kill children.
The anchor noted 4 of the 11 terrorists killed were under the age of 18. Bennett responded with this question.
You know, it's quite remarkable that you'd say that, because they're killing us. Now, if there's a 17-year-old Palestinian that's shooting at your family, Anjana, what is he?
After the interview, the BBC apologized for the anchor's statement. While this was a legitimate subject to examine in the interview, we apologize that the language used in this line of questioning was not phrased well and was inappropriate.
I found their apology to be rather pathetic. That was just such a preposterous allegation, especially during an operation in which there were how many civilian deaths, Chris? 0.
Gil Huffman is executive director of Honest Reporting, a group that monitors the media's reporting on Israel. He says when the media gets it wrong about Israel, it can become a matter of life and death. He points to coverage during this year's Ramadan, when Muslim rioters barricaded themselves in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. When Israeli police went inside to stop the rioters from harming worshippers, the story got flipped upside down.
They took YouTube videos that made it look like it was the IDF attacking these rioters, and of course the headlines around the world were Israeli police attack worshippers in mosque. And that was the exact opposite of the truth. But that false reporting was used as an excuse to fire rockets at Israelis from Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza.
Hoffman says another example is when CNN anchor Christian Amanpour claimed Rabbi Ds' wife and 2 daughters were killed in a shootout rather than murdered in a terror attack. Weeks later, Amanpour apologized. CBN News asked Rabbi D about her statement.
Tremendously upset, and the kids to be accused of a family being terrorists. Then we had 2 other interactions, as you say, with CNN, both of which made me feel like I was the terrorist and the terrorist somehow was the victim. And I think this is endemic in the CNN reporting, and so we are planning to take them to court, and the planning for that is currently underway.
Hoffman believes when people point out the media's bias, it can make a difference.
It's more important than ever that we get the best coverage possible of Israel to save lives, and that's what Honest Reporting does in monitoring the media and making sure that the coverage improves.
Thankful very much for the helpful news reporting from our friends at CBM throughout this. And of course, we remember that horrifying attack on Rabbi Ds Family. Lost his wife and 2 of his daughters in a Palestinian gun attack earlier in the year. Absolute tragedy. So very helpful to also have his perspective and commentary on that.
No, absolutely. And so I think when with the course of this program, why we decided to do this program today was to really unpack the truth of Israel's military operation known as House and Garden, that took place in a 48-hour military operation to dismantle the Palestinian terror networks in Jenin, but also to counter a lot of the lies and false reporting and essentially wanting to tell the Palestinian narrative rather than actually tell the truth of the situation, to readdress this and confront media bias by our mainstream media. Now, these media outlets, whether it's BBC or whether it's CNN or some other kind of big international news networks, is that if they continually to report false information, continually give inaccurate facts, then the question is, how can their news coverage be trusted? And if you can't trust their news coverage, then their whole integrity as a media outlet is put into question. But particularly when it comes to the BBC, is that they are funded directly by the UK taxpayer. So surely as taxpayers paying the licence fee, that we should have some say over their coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, rather than actually accusing the Israeli Defence Force of killing children. The fact that this operation, there were no Palestinian civilians that were actually killed in this operation, despite the fact Israel sent in 2,000 IDF soldiers, special forces, using military drones to carry operation, including the aircraft and bulldozers as well. is nothing less than an absolute miracle and shows the highest level of morality and regard to human life, that 12 Palestinian terrorists were killed. And you know, if you play with fire, you're going to get burnt. And Israel had no other choice but to go in and root out that terrorist infrastructure in Jenin.
But the lies continue, and the same lies that were used 21 years ago are being used again right now. Melanie Phillips, writing in JNS, says the malevolent reporting on Israel's Jenin operation. Much of the West believes the anti-Semitic lie that the Jews are responsible for their own destruction. Yet the New York Times saluted Palestinian terrorism as an ethos of defiance and described Jenin admirably as having, quote, a long legacy as a bastion of armed struggle, end quote. I guess if that's what you call terrorism. I mean, it's shocking that this is being reported in this particular way. Other media outlets misrepresented Israel's response to murderous terrorism as wanton aggression. They did so through systemic decontextualization, having largely ignored the growing toll of Israeli terrorist victims and the attacks that Israeli security forces thwart almost daily. And indeed, those that tragically aren't able to be thwarted, like the immediate aftermath, which saw people severely injured and wounded in Tel Aviv.
And a pregnant mother's now lost her baby because of it, which would have been instigated by Israeli Arabs that are influenced by Hamas. Now, the great danger that we see in false media reporting, as we saw on that excellent CBN News item referring to the BBC, is the fact that this poisons people's hearts and minds and attitudes. We're living in a time where most people get their news coverage from TV news broadcasts. Not many people have the time and the diligence to go through the newspapers or read the newspapers or listen to radio reports. Some do, probably more. But that's where they get their reporting from. They look at the images with their eyes and then their eyes tell them what everything is going through, so they don't check the facts, don't check the details. Let's just take away this news item so I know what I'm informed of what's happened of this military operation. I'll make up my mind. The Israelis are just showing aggression and attacking Jenin for no apparent reason other than they actually want to, which creates a false narrative but actually leads to an increase in Jew hatred. And this is why this reporting is so dangerous.
It is this interview, which we already saw a little bit of, I remember seeing as it was happening just right after on social media, where the BBC anchor Anjana Gadgil said the Israeli military are calling this a military operation, but we now know that young people are being killed, 4 of them under 18. Is that really what the military set out to do before saying that Israeli forces were happy to kill children? Well, the issue, as Bennett rightly replied quite robustly, is that the Palestinians who were killed were terrorists. The age doesn't matter in this situation. We're talking, first of all, about 16 at the youngest, 17. There's at what point do we draw the line? Do we say, okay, a gun is being put in your face by a responsible individual who lacks our Western criteria of majority adult status, but it's 16 or 17 years old, is acting fully in their own good conscience, however seared that may be, believing that they are in the right, but perpetrating an act of terror? What do? Do you just say, well, we can't do anything about it because it's under 18?
Well, our mainstream media would like us to take that position, but I think it's important, isn't it, that as Christians that we respond with truth and that we counter the dangerous lies put out by the mainstream media and their reporting of Israel, because this is imperative that we have to be bearers of light, we have to be bearers of truth, we have to tell the situation that Israel's facing. This is what we've done through this program, is actually put this Israeli military operation that occurred last week into its historical and contemporary context in order to understand why Israel had to go in against these terrorists in Jenin, why Israel had to put their own soldiers' lives at risk in order to protect Israeli citizens. And you guarantee that no one will be discussing the fact that this is what alarms the Israelis the most, is that these Palestinian terrorist organizations getting their hands on rockets and launching them at Jewish communities nearby, launching them at Israel's international airport, Ben Gurion Airport, Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, is a game changer that actually threatens Israel's national security.
And of course, this all sits in the context of ongoing struggle, ongoing tensions with the Iranian regime as well, who are backing these terror organizations. And it's estimated that Tehran provides up to $100 million annually in combined support to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So this is all ideologically driven by Islamic extremism and fundamentalism, and it must be resisted. We as Christians have the responsibility to stand on truth. We must stand on the truth to counter dangerous lies put out by mainstream media and their reporting on Israel in this case. I think we've sought to stand on truth on occasions where it makes Israel potentially look bad or negative to some degree. In the same way where that this is completely inaccurate, we must stand on the truth. So we do hope that this program, that Behind the Headlines this evening, has been of aid to you, our wonderful viewers.
Yep, Regan, great doing a program with you tonight, and I want to thank you for watching this program at home. We are told to be watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem. That means we watch, we pray and intercede, and we get our facts right when it comes to what's happening in Israel, so that we can pray more effectively, we can stand and counter the lies of the enemy regarding Israel and the Jewish people, and we become a blessing to Jerusalem. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.